So Dina, you will let us know when we have enough people so that we can start?
I will.
Thank you.
Although we're recording, is it such that the speaker is prominent? Because right now it's great. I see the highlights of I see your screen. How are you guys seeing it? No. I'm just curious as to what you guys are seeing. It might be my setting.
I see the screen as well, but when Stamatina is talking, I see her as well in my screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Good
luck. Thank you. Oh, right, spotlight. Dina, can you spotlight Martin and Stamatina?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Well, it is 1 o'clock, and I think we should get started. Martin?
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Martin van Pietersen from Belgium. I work at Ibasho Gallery here in Antwerp, and I have the pleasure to host this talk for you. I am a member of the APAD Education Committee, and as you probably are aware, we are organizing a series of talks in the run-up to our photography show, which will be held next week in New York City. Today, I have the pleasure to announce or to introduce Stamatina Gregory to you. She is the Chief Curator and Director of Exhibitions and Collections at the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Art. The Leslie-Lohman Museum is the only LGBTQ+ art museum in the world. Stamatina is going to give us the highlights of the collection of the photographic collection of the museum. As a cis father of 2 queer daughters, I'm certainly very interested to hear what she has to tell us. A couple of practical points. First of all, can I ask you to mute your phone during the call? Also, we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the session. But if you already have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. At the end of the session, we will also ask people if they have questions, they can unmute their phones. Well, Stamatina, I think I'm going to leave it to you and get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Dina and Arnika and everyone at APAD, Blinn. I'm so, it's an honor to be invited to talk about the, some of the photographs in the collection of the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Art. Stamatina Gregory, my pronouns are they or she. And for the past 2 years and change, I've been the chief curator and the director of exhibitions and collections at the museum. I would say as chief curator, oops, I'm having a problem advancing, okay. The question I am asked most often about the museum is, why haven't I heard of it? And where is it? And so, as a first order of business, I'm sharing directions with you, which I'm realizing may or may not be visible, but we are located in New York City in the Soho neighborhood on 26 Wooster Street. That's at the corner of Grand and Wooster. Take the ACE to Canal Street. We would be very, very happy to see you here at the museum. This is an image of part of our facade with its current project by Chitra Ganesh called A City Will Reveal Its Secrets If You Know How to Ask. Often there are photographic projects on our facade. This is one of the few that is actually illustration based, but every year for the past 5 years, we have done a project with, we have done a commissioned project with an artist on the windows of our facade. The next one is scheduled for this fall. So the history of Leslie-Lohman's collection began with the history of its two founders, Charles Leslie and Fritz Lohman, and the history of the queer community and the political movement that mushroomed in the wake of the Stonewall riots that broke out in Greenwich Village, very nearby, in 1969. So the story of their life's work is also intertwined with the emergence of the Soho district as a New York City arts, center of gravity, and also with the unfolding of contemporary mainstream art around the world, or like the direction of contemporary art as mainstream. So we kind of survey the wider cultural landscape of those early years, thinking through the trajectory of their collecting, which I will talk about a little bit, in the, parallel to the struggle for LGBTQ plus civil rights and self-expression, in alignment with the kind of steamroller of social change movements that were contemporary. The legendary decade of the 60s, the civil rights movement, Vietnam War resistance, second wave feminism, and various countercultural movements. Charles and Fritz met in Manhattan in 1961. They lived together for 48 years until Fritz's death at 87 in December of 2009. In 1969, Charles and Fritz invited some guests to their loft on Soho's Prince Street to view works by, at the time, gay male artists who couldn't gain access to mainstream galleries. So Charles and Fritz were both Soho activists. They were also fledgling real estate developers. They had been a couple for close to a decade. At this time, owning and exhibiting homoerotic art, so-called, was essentially illegal as it was classified as obscenity. Selectively enforced, but illegal nonetheless. And with an accepted wide culture of institutionalized homophobia, such work was rarely shown. So this exhibition extended beyond this projected week's time. It went on for 5 weeks. It essentially never ended. Here's an image of that exhibition. The collection now spans 5 centuries and more than 25,000 objects. The vast majority of these objects date from the second half of the 20th century to the present. nearly half of these are photography, and it's primarily the photo works that I will touch on in this talk. Some of the work collected early on by the founders includes this and many other works by Wilhelm von Glöden, who was, virtually underknown, very, very underknown in the mid-20th century. Douglas Juliff's image of Neil Bate from the 1940s, and the collection also holds almost the entirety of Neil Bate's body of work. Neil Bate was a protege of Tom of Finland. Another image of Neil, Berenice. This is actually a Horst P. Horst image. And also other important works from the first half of the 20th century, Berenice Abbott's image of the lesbian icon Jane Heap, and this picture by Diana Davies of the outside of the Stonewall Inn. And so, as I said, the first exhibition occurred really just weeks before the Stonewall uprisings. And so, to paint a picture of where we were in 1969, and indeed where we might be imminently headed, given recent political developments. So same-sex acts were illegal, and that included kissing, dancing, and holding hands, illegal in almost every state in the US. Additionally, there was a 3-article law stating that people had to wear at least 3 pieces of clothing that corresponded to their assigned gender. Stonewall in a quiet moment. Diana Davies was one of the leading photojournalists that documented the feminist and gay liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s. We have several of her works in the collection. Davies is an artist who left high school at 16 and began to work sweeping out coffee houses in Greenwich Village, which put her in touch with the emerging activist movements and music scene at the time, self-taught photographer. Serving alcohol to gay people was illegal until the 1966 sip-in at Julia's Bar in the West Village. And this is Tim McMath's sip-in from 2011 in our collection. In case the caption is hard to read, it says, "We are homosexuals, we are orderly, we intend to remain orderly, and we are asking for service." Gay bars were routinely raided by the NYPD. Many of the gay bars, most of them, were owned and operated by the mafia, who saw business opportunities in the demand for spaces where gay folks could congregate. The bar owners regularly paid off the police to overlook their gay clientele. Sometimes the police would even give the owners a heads up that they were about to come raid the establishment. This happened regularly. Because the Stonewall was cheaper to enter than other gay bars, had lots of space, and it still allowed dancing, it became a really important gathering space, especially for those who were not welcome elsewhere, including trans folks. Trans folks were included under the umbrella of, quote, drag queens, included trans women and gender nonconforming people and homeless gay youth. During the very early hours of June 28th, 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn, and the patrons revolted and resisted violently against the police harassment, causing the police to retreat by hiding in their own van. Hard to imagine these days. 6 days of protests followed, and this energy was a catalyst for ongoing queer organizing. And as such, Stonewall has become an empowering symbol of global proportions. Of course, this wasn't the first of its kind, given that the 1966 Compton cafeteria riots had already occurred in San Francisco, but it was commemorated with the 1970 Christopher Street Liberation March. And this sparked marches in other cities such as LA, and this developed into pride parades all over the world. And it's this documentation of the celebrations from 1969 to the present moment that is very well represented in the photographs of our collection. Here is an image of the Gay Liberation Front in 1970 by Peter Hujar for a poster that was later made by Jim Farrat. The Gay Liberation Front formed very soon after the Stonewall Rebellions. Of course, trans women of color were very crucial in this moment. but the wider gay movement wasn't automatically accepting of everyone who had struggled for liberation. Of course, the people, for example, in Peter Hujar's photo were largely white. People of color at that time didn't always feel like they had enough privilege to risk coming out publicly. This is an image by Kay Tobin of Sylvia Rivera at the fountain in Washington Square Park. And this is actually in 1970, not 1973. Sylvia Rivera, whom I think many folks in the audience would recognize, really faced very loud opposition, primarily from gay cisgender men during her 1973 speech at the Gay Liberation Day rally. This was the famous "Y'all better quiet down" speech that drew attention to the marginalization of trans people, people of color, poor people, and incarcerated people in the LGBTQ movement, the political leadership and public face of which was primarily white and middle class. Kay Tobin, who recently passed away in 2021, well-known American, well, perhaps less well-known American photographer and gay rights activist, the first out lesbian journalist in the US, photojournalist in the US. So she photographed thousands of activists, portraits of activists, marches, and other events in the 1960s and 70s. She was a person who was critical, incidentally, in the movement to push the American Psychological Association to remove homosexuality from the DSM. So as gay life and activism reached a kind of point of newfound strength, if not radical inclusivity, the Leslie-Lohman collection was just beginning to branch out from this collection of like only looking at homoerotica, right? Although photographs by artists other than cis men, like Tobin's here, would not become part of the collection for several decades, right? This was acquired later. Oops. There is a vibrant post-Stonewall, post-DSM queer culture of the 1970s that really focused on photographic representations of desire, right? And this found representation in our collection, in the work of Georges Drouot, for example. This was his lover, Wing Ding, Robert Mapplethorpe, Self-Portrait with a Whip from 1978. Peter Hujar again, with this image of Bruce de Sainte-Croix from 1976. I love this Hujar image in our collection of Fran Lebowitz at home in Morristown. And this image, which has recently entered our collection by Robert Giard of Arthur Tress as the Muse of Photography in 1978. The museum was also at this time collecting images, for example, by artists like Andy Warhol, who both did not hide their homosexuality, and yet not all of their work was as collected as some of the most iconic pieces. Warhol expressed some ambivalence about his more sexual work and wrote in his diaries, "I shouldn't call them nudes, it should be something more artistic, like landscapes." Path-making lesbian photographers also found their way into the collection with works from this time, the post-Stonewall pre-AIDS era. This is T. Corinne's Untitled Woman in Wheelchair with Able-Bodied Lover. Jeb, Joan E. Byron, whose works of photography are characterized by her as belonging in the public sphere. Jeb's imagery was Our Last Facade Project. This is her Gloria and Charmaine from 1979. Ellen Schlumsky, Ellen Schlumsky's images of meetings of the radical lesbians, this one in Andy's New York, are also in the collection. And the work of Barbara Hammer. The latter, before her death in 2019, had a monographic exhibition at the museum. So contemporary artists in our collection have also revisited this particular period in queer history. This is a work by Ben Cuevas that recently entered the collection, a queer non-binary HIV-positive Latinx artist. Cuevas, like many artists in our collection, is in deep dialogue with both art history and queer history and photographic history, right? And so for this series called Reinserted, Cuevas recontextualized portraits of sex workers, taking archival images of them, of sex workers, hustlers, public cruising, and separates the individual from their original environment. So inserting them in the present day of the same location, right? So this is the Greenwich Village, Sephora, cruising spots of the past have become Sephoras, strip malls, parking lots, convenience stores. The series highlights changes and gentrification to the city, as well as the ways that sex work has changed, and speaks to visibility and invisibility, and thinks about the relationship between the past and the present, especially at this moment in a post-FOSTA-SESTA world, and in one in which we are all working from home. Digital interactions take on a whole new valence. This is Reinserted Selma Avenue, featuring a male hustler on Selma in Hollywood sometime in the 1970s, originally photographed by Pat Rocco, reinserted into a background of the same location in present day LA. Many works in our collection came about in the 1980s due to a radical shift in Leslie-Lohman's collecting. So at the same time that a new generation of activist art entered circulation and collection and the public sphere, and the AIDS pandemic began to decimate queer community, entire portfolios of work by dead and dying artists were left literally on the gallery's doorstep. The commercial gallery of Leslie-Lohman, which grew from their collecting efforts and exhibition efforts in the through the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, eventually became the Leslie-Lohman Gay Art Foundation in 1990, the first foundation in the US to have the word gay in the title. This only came about after 3 years of lobbying the federal government. The IRS would call the offices and ask questions like snickering, "So are you going to hang this work in your bathroom?" The foundation's mission pivoted at this time to rescuing and preserving and exhibiting these works often by HIV positive artists with AIDS, artists that were, dying or already dead, to exhibit works that would otherwise have been lost. Thomas McGovern from his series Bearing Witness to AIDS, a photographic portfolio. This is an image from the political funeral for John Greenberg. Here is Sylvia Rivera again from Robert Giard's series, Particular Voices. So in 1985, after attending a performance of Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart, which was one of the first dramas dealing with the impact of AIDS on gay life, the photographer Robert Giard, who we saw earlier in his portrait of Arthur Tress, decided to devote his energies and his practice to preserving the rapidly diminishing gay and lesbian community. So this was a 2-decade-long project of photographing over 600 gay and lesbian writers who would now be included under the umbrella of queer LGBTQ+, from famous playwrights to emerging novelists to poets to activists, such as Sylvia Rivera. Here's his image in 1987 of the writers Cheryl Clark and Jewel Gomez. This body of work is an extraordinary visual record of this flowering of queer voices in the wake of Stonewall and the AIDS crises, ongoing AIDS crises, while also paying homage to many earlier 20th century activists and writers who had urged the creation of community identity or otherwise gave public voice to queer collectivity and culture. These are 5 members of other countries, the Black Poets Collective from 1987. Contemporary artists in our collection also engage with the history and culture while they were or are still with us. This is a recent acquisition by the artist Conrad Venture. These are 2 images of Mario Montez taken before the Warhol superstar's death. And this is also a recently acquired work by the artist Kia LaBeija called 11 from 2015. So historically, when we talk about the AIDS epidemic, we talk a lot about the gay white male experience, right, historically. These, of course, are stories that should be expressed, but it's a narrative largely of omission, which has extended to even contemporary curatorial explorations of these bodies of work. So 11 is a piece that Kia created on the anniversary of the day of the passing of her mother from HIV/AIDS. It had been 11 years since that passing. This is a photo that she took in her actual doctor's office. This is the doctor that had cared for Kia since her birth as an infant born with HIV. She's in the dress that she wore to her high school prom, which is a statement itself. As a child born with HIV, Kia was not expected to make it as far as her high school prom. She was born in 1990. And antiretroviral medication that was life-saving for tens of thousands of folks didn't come around until approximately 1995, 1996. There was no expectation of her survival. So with this acquisition and with a recent revision and acceptance by our board of an acquisitions plan that commits to collecting the work of artists that are underrepresented in the collection, Black, Indigenous, and other artists of color, and trans and gender non-conforming artists. Our acquisitions are not limited to photography, but photography remains a critical part of our collecting. And the genre of the photographic is itself also a critical part of art making. This is a detail of a recent acquisition, a gift by Daniel S. Berger, Jellygrass Volcanoes, Gender Optional from 2017. Paul Mapagi Sapuya's Darkroom Mirror Study from 2017 also. And in the realm of the photographic as opposed to the photograph, Jeffrey Gibson's I'm Looking for Sunshine from 2021, which we have classified as a photographic purchase. Although the entirety of this work of art is not only made of the photographic medium. This is an image by the artist Castles, Becoming an Image, performance still number 4. This was performed at the National Theatre Studio in London in 2013. So Castles is an artist that we've also acquired a very large and important non-photographic piece from, PIST, from 2018. Castles has a very deep engagement with conceptual art, body art, feminism, and the aesthetics of gay male bodybuilding and Hollywood. This is a performance. This is documentation of a performance that took place in a completely light-free environment, which is also a deep engagement with photography itself. The only elements in this space were the audience, a photographer, the performer, Castles, and a 1,500-pound block of clay about the same height as the artist. So throughout the performance, in the darkness, they use their skills as a boxer fighter. They've trained as a boxer for more than a decade to unleash an attack of beating the form of clay. A sculpting process resulted on account of these blows. For the duration of the performance, the artist was effectively, had no sight, was blind, as was the audience, as was the photographer. The only light source emitted came from the flash on the photographer's camera. And so the burst of light allowed the audience to only see suspended moments of the performance, much like a live photograph. And so the photograph is the only way that this queer performance is made visible. Castle's image is on the cover of a body of work and essays on our collection, published in 2018, available at the museum. And the future of our collection is not only the acquisition of important works by artists that add to the diversity of our collection, but also a process of engagement with contemporary artists. What does it mean for us to have a body of work of more than 25,000 images, more than 10,000 photographs, and think about them not only as an archive, not only as a repository, but as something living, right? A living piece of history. This is an image of the trans, Indigenous, and Asian American artist Coyote Park, who is our first inaugural interventionist fellow at the museum. And so we have a newly instituted program in which we invite artists and other creative producers to engage with the collection for a period of months and to present a reading of the collection, a creative reading of the collection in a format of their choice. So at the moment, Coyote has engaged with some of the works by cis gay men overrepresented in our collection, thinking about what kind of space the photographs in our collection represent, what kind of freedom they represented at the time in which they were made, what kind of freedoms and public and private space are still unavailable to trans folks of color, to Indigenous folks. And so in these readings of works in our collection, Coyote is creating an interpretation through their own photographic process, which will be on view at the museum, together with the collection works in November of this year. That is my talk. Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Stamatina. We will now open our Q&A. So everybody who has a question can post it in the Q&A box, or can simply unmute their phone and speak up. To kick things off, Stamatina, I have a question for you. The collection seems very much American focused. Is that really the remit of the museum, or is there an ambition or an interest to look at other sort of continents, Europe or Asia? Me as a European and a gallery specialized in Japanese photography is certainly some very interesting things happening in queer art in those two areas. So I was wondering if this is at all something you are considering.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I'm really glad that you brought it up, because although the talk I gave is very US centered, the collection is international, right? There's an emphasis on the US, but the remit of collecting for the museum has never been limited to the US. And actually, I would say that, in terms of our international holdings, work from Japan is actually very well represented, but perhaps less in photography than in other works, right? The project that I brought up at the end with Coyote Park is actually also engaged with some of the work by Go Mishima, the printmaker. And we also have quite a bit of European photography too. We have a large collection of the work of Gerhard Pohl, for example, and some of the work we are now collecting is really focused on the Caribbean and on South America. So it's the only dedicated LGBTQ art museum in the world. We definitely feel like our remit is also international. And you know, collecting, as we know, is sometimes a slower process than other aspects of museum activity, right? And so like our, you know, our exhibitions have been much more international for longer. For example, we have an exhibition up which includes many photographs of the work of Lorenza Bottner, who is the Chilean-German artist who passed away from AIDS-related complications in the 1990s. As a disabled trans migrant woman, her work was very marginalized during her lifetime. But as she moved from Punta Arenas, Chile to Santiago to Germany, to New York, and then eventually to Barcelona, she created a tremendous body of work, including wonderful photographs that I hope enter our collection. You know, we consider it part of our remit to engage with those histories, collect them eventually, but sometimes exhibitions move faster than collections. In addition, we also have a fellowship program, which is very international, which is only out of 12 fellows every year, only a quarter to a third of them are based in the US.
I see. Okay. And there's a question here from Arnika Dawkins. How do you select and acquire the works in your collection?
So we finally have a collections process in place as of last year. And we have very limited acquisition funds that are thankfully increasing. Some of them increasing through deaccessioning processes, which are a healthy part of all museum collecting, but which we did not engage in for a number of years. So we have set processes for considering donations and also considering purchased acquisitions, right? Many people come to us every year wanting to donate works. We are actually, because we have over 25,000 objects in the collection, we're actually now becoming very selective about what we do take. Especially since, you know, for decades, the collection was only about accumulation and less about the management of the collection, right? And so we have a collections committee to the board that reviews all proposed donations. And in terms of purchased acquisitions, that same committee also votes on those acquisitions. And anyone can bring a proposal to the committee from within the museum.
I see. Okay, thank you very much, Stamatina. Can I ask, is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? If so, please put it in the Q&A or chat or speak up if you like. Yes, another good question from Arnika. Tell us about the museum's upcoming exhibitions, please.
So that's a great question. In conjunction with the current Lorenza Bottner exhibition, we are going to have an auxiliary exhibition that opens in July based on Lorenza's engagement with fashion. And so in addition to a number of additional photographs and drawings by Lorenza, we plan to have 3 weekends of workshops in the space focused on the intersections of migration, transness, disability, and fashion. And so that will happen between July 15th and July 31st. This fall, we, across the museum, we are going to welcome an exhibition called Indicencia, curated by the artist and independent curator Nicolas Dumi de Espejo, which includes around 16 Latinx artists from the US, Latin and South America, and Europe, that engages with the queered liberation theology of Marcela Althaus Reed, who is an Argentinian philosopher and theologist. And so that includes works, for example, by Nadia Granados, who is an artist from Colombia, Nao Bustamante, who's based in Los Angeles, Felix Gonzalez Torres, and many other artists. So that will definitely be something that you should join us for. In 2023, we have a very photo-focused exhibition coming to the museum, organized by Ariel Goldberg, called Images on Which to Build. And this looks at histories of lesbian and wider queer photographic pedagogies. So looking at photography as community building space and pedagogical space, primarily in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That show is actually opening first. We are partnering with the CAC in Cincinnati, which is itself a museum with a really important photographic history, particularly around the historic Robert Mapplethorpe show. They are premiering the exhibition, and it will come to Leslie-Lohman in March of 2023.
Wonderful. I have a question here by Louis Stallman. Is the artist's declared sexuality important for the selection committee in determining whether or not to acquire a piece of art?
That's a great question, Louis. It is the remit of the museum to support queer artists. At the same time, queerness is also not like the determining factor in thinking through whether to acquire a work of art, to accept it into the collection. Because there are, for example, like many queer artists whose work we decide not to bring into the collection, right? And so some of the questions that we ask in terms of our criteria are, how does this work contribute to the narratives of LGBTQ history that we want to tell in the museum, that we can tell in the museum? How does this add? How does this expand? What is the relationship to narratives of queerness, right? This can extend through work that is not only figurative, even though I have shown you overwhelmingly figurative work, but also to abstraction, also to, the place of the work of art in the world. What kind of work has this work done in the world? What kind of work does it have the potential to do, right? And so the primary concern is not necessarily the artist's sexuality, although that is often the perception. Many donations begin with, I'm a queer artist, I'm a gay artist, I'm a lesbian artist, I'm a trans artist. Here is all my work. You are the institution to collect it. Or more often, here is a body of work that I've collected.
Right. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. If there's no further questions, I would like to wrap it up. Stamatina, thank you so much for your time and for the interesting presentation. I obviously hope to meet you in New York next week. And for those of you who are listening, I hope to see all of you at APED next week. And I wish you all a wonderful day or evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you at the museum.
Thank you. Bye now.
I will say that was fascinating. And It makes me realize how naive I really am.
I realized maybe I should have made it 15 minutes longer. I was like, I always try to like cut down because time is always a factor. And I'm like, oh, I could have gone a little bit more,
I
but
guess I just don't think about, you know, color, sexuality, like it's a piece, it's art. And I'm just really naive. And I guess I also don't know the history behind it. It's just eye-opening. And I guess in light of our, I guess, political situation in our country, for lack of a better word, I think everything's coming to the forefront.
that is really true.
You know, myself being Jewish, like we've, you know, been persecuted like since the beginning of time, but so is every other group, no matter what they are, everybody's, and it's just, we're going backwards instead of forwards. But I'm going to get off my political bandwagon.
All right, Dina.
Cool. I well, stick my foot in my mouth.
No, you're great. Yeah, it's an extraordinarily troubling time. What can we say? Like,
I just got home from college, and we had this conversation last night, and I feel bad for the kids.
Yeah.
It's just, there's just nothing positive these days. Like my girlfriend's an attorney and she just lost a Title IX case that she should never have lost. And, you know, a woman accused a guy and there was no evidence, but he lost. And I said to my son, like, that could have been you. And in any situation, anything could have been us. So thank you for opening my eyes to the history, because I guess I grow up blind to these things.
I mean, we're here to, not only tell the stories of the present and not only to be a space in which we can have these conversations, but to also talk about like historic struggle, how that's been expressed through art and photography and material culture, and like, what kinds of visions that artists had like in the past for a better world and in the present.
Yeah, it's certainly more individualistic, I think, in the present than it is than it was in the past, right? Perhaps maybe in the queer community, it's a bit more as a community still, but I do feel it's very individualistic in other areas. Every man for himself, it feels like. But anyway,
I'm
cool.
really looking forward to the exhibition.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Seeing the response to this moment.
We had over 60 people on today.
Yeah.
Oh, great. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And there's no good time, either lunchtime or later time, earlier time. There's just no good time. So, right. This is as good a time as any, and it's just when people can fit it into their schedules. But we do know that people do go back and watch, and we've had a lot of questions about, will you post it? So it will get a lot of vision on it.
Dina, can we close off the call? Because it seems like there's people that we're not quite closed.
I'm going to end this. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Thanks.